Everybody, this is Dream, and today we've got a nice big slate for DraftKings. We have a lot of games, a lot of pitchers to take a look at, a lot of batters potentially to hit home runs. And with that said, we have 5 teams that I think are pretty stackable today: Atlanta, Houston, Baltimore, Boston, and Toronto. Just overall a huge slate, and so I think scoring is going to be fairly high today. And so you don't want to. I don't think you're going to look to spend down on many pitchers because a lot of the pitchers don't have a ton of upside when it comes to having big game scoring, considering their matchups and stuff like that. But I think some of the pitchers at the top have some good opportunities. So before I get into that, if you don't mind, please like this video and make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really does help, and I do appreciate it when everybody does that. Also, if you're interested, check in the description for Discord and for Patreon. We have a lot of fun in Discord, and I do appreciate anybody that joins either one of those. Discord is free, obviously. With that said, let's get into the pitchers. So we have Lance McCullers first for Houston against the Arizona Diamondbacks. He's only started 7 games this season, but he's averaging 20 fantasy points a game. And aside from a game against Baltimore and Atlanta, he's been extremely solid. Though he is a little bit capped from his upside because he hasn't gone super deep in these games. He's had the last 3, he's been better, but his strikeouts kind of go up and down a little bit. And so he does have, I think he's in a 20 to 25 point range game for today, which obviously isn't super ideal because of his price point, but he is pretty safe as well. Then we're going to take a look at Robbie Ray. Now, he's had 2 solid games against Texas with 18 and 33 fantasy points, but he hasn't been very consistent lately. He's been all over the place, in fact. Though his all over the place games have typically been against good teams, with the exception of the Angels, who for some reason he just stinks at against. The other day. But overall, he's been solid most of the season. And then we're going to look at Zach Wheeler for Philadelphia. Now, he's been pretty good this season, but he's not been quite as good the last few games. And so I do have to worry about him a little bit. But in his 2 games against Chicago, he's had 25 and 35 fantasy points. And he's only had 1 really bad game in the last, since the mid-July, rather. And so I think he's in a pretty good spot here. I'm sorry, he had 1 game against Chicago, 23.35. I read my own thing wrong. I'm sorry about that. Anyhow, then we're going to look at Lance Lynn. Now we're going to get a little bit cheaper with Lance Lynn. And he's averaging 23 fantasy points a game, despite having a bad game in his last game against Cleveland. But he's been pretty solid as of late. Now, the only real issue with him is that aside from that 1 bad game, he's had a couple of bad games against Minnesota earlier this season, and so that does bother me a little bit because he's had 3.9 and 7 fantasy points in those 2 games. But overall, I still think he's in a pretty good spot here, and he's definitely a little bit cheaper than the top options. Carlos Carrasco is a guy I probably like a little bit better than Lynn, and he's a little bit less expensive, though he's not quite as good of a pitcher. He's been solid at 18 fantasy points the last 10 games, but he's also been kind of up and down. He's had some really bad games as well, including a bad game against Washington. But overall, he's usually pretty good at home, and this will be a home game for him. And Miami has not been very good. And in his 4 games against Miami this season, he's got 25, 31, 13, and 20 versus Miami this season. Now I'm going to get into the hitters. Now, if I mentioned that they have a batting average and a home run count against the pitcher of that particular team, then I'll mention that, and that's just to note that they have at least 10 at-bats and a 300 batting average or better against that particular pitcher. And we have quite a few of those throughout the slate today, and so I will mention those as I go through the slate here. So at catcher, my top option is William Contreras and Travis d'Arnaud for Atlanta. Now, obviously, both of them are home run threats, and whoever starts is going to be the top option, I think, on this particular slate with the nice plus matchup Atlanta has. I do like d'Arnaud probably a little bit better than Contreras on this particular slate, but both of them are solid for Atlanta against Washington. Now, Will Smith has had a career against Snell where he's hit 357 with a home run, and I do think he's in a good spot here against them, so you have to consider him on this particular slate. Still don't love the Dodgers on this particular slate, but I still think they're okay, especially him, in this particular situation. Then we're going to look at Sean Murphy for Oakland against the Angels. He's been really solid this season, and he's been hitting the balls pretty well. 7.62 home runs not 2 home runs, I'm sorry. He hadn't had a home run in the last 10, but I think he's due for one. He's been hitting the ball really well, and Oakland's been hitting the ball well as well. And then we're going to look at Yadier Molina. Now, Molina has been very boomer bust this season, but he's averaging about 7 fantasy points a game the last 10, including 3 home runs. If he does play, then he is somebody I like in this particular matchup, simply because he's had a really good career against Hauser, Milwaukee's pitcher. He's hit .316 with a home run in his career against him. And then Kirk for Toronto, also a guy that's been really solid this season. He's averaging about 6.5 for the last 10 games. He's in a really good spot here for Toronto, and I think that he's somebody you have to take in consideration. He's also hit .385 against the pitcher of the Yankees, Talion, this season. And I'm also going to mention Jansen for Toronto. If he does play, then he's going to be somebody you want to take a consideration at. He's averaging almost 6.5 points per game this season for his team as well. At first base, we have Mountcastle for Baltimore against Waka. Now, Mountcastle has actually been really good against Waka in his career. .385 with 2 home runs. Like I said, if I mention that's because I've had at least 10 at-bats against the pitcher. I don't really pay any attention to those stats very much unless I've had just a ton of at-bats, and at least 10, if not more. With that said, he's been hitting the ball pretty well, and he had a really solid game yesterday as well, so I think he's in another great spot here for Baltimore, in a very high-scoring game between Baltimore and Boston. Dan Vogelbach for New York Mets, he looks like he's in a pretty good spot here. He's averaging 7.6 the last 10 games, including a home run. He's been going stretches that he's been really good, and so I like to take advantage of him in those situations. Then we got Matt Olson, who finally got out of a slump yesterday with a home run, and he hit the ball extremely well, and I think he's in a really good spot here to continue to hit the ball well for Atlanta against Washington. And then Ty France for Seattle. He's going up against a young pitcher, but I still think he's been hitting the ball so well, 10.3 fantasy points a game. He's had several really big games, not even with home runs, which is even better. And so if he can sneak a home run as well, then that's only going to make us even happier. Anthony Rizzo is averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game for the last 10, and I think he's been hitting the ball really well for the Yankees as they finally start to get their season going. Obviously, this is a little bit of a tougher matchup for him, but he still hit .368 in his career against the pitcher, and he's had 2 home runs against him on his career, which is Barrios. And then we're going to look at Vladimir Guerrero Jr. against Talion, who's also hit .300 with a home run in his career against him. And obviously he's pretty expensive, but he's one of my favorite opportunities for a home run on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Rowdy Tellez for Milwaukee against St. Louis. Now, he's very boomer bust, but he's been extremely good against Mikolas in his career with a .364 batting average and a home run. At second base, we have Kiki Hernandez. Sorry about that. For Boston. He's been extremely good lately. 7 fantasy points a game, including a 14-point game yesterday. And he really doesn't even have to do it with home runs. He's also hit .333 against Baltimore's pitcher today. And so I think he's a solid option at second or outfielder. And he's pretty inexpensive at $3,100. Whit Merrifield is also pretty cheap here on DraftKings, which is really nice. He's hitting almost 9 fantasy points a game the last 10, and he's got a nice plus matchup here against Talion. Brendan Donovan he is somebody I like today against Hauser for Milwaukee. He's averaging almost 7 fantasy points a game. He's been a little bit boomer bust lately, but he has potential in this particular matchup. Jose Altuve is obviously pretty expensive, but he's got a really nice matchup today against Davies. And I look for him to have a really solid game. And he's been 9.6 the last 10 games, including a couple home runs. Colton Wong looks like a really good option today for Milwaukee against St. Louis. He's averaging 10 fantasy points a game, and it's just a matter of time before he hits another home run. And then Diaz for the Houston. I don't know how you say your first name exactly, but he's averaging almost 7 fantasy points a game. He's been really boomer bust lately. But he has a .455 average against Arizona's pitcher, Davies, in his career. That's at least 10 at-bats. And I don't remember how many total at-bats he had, but he's been really good against him. And so I definitely think he's somebody to take a look at. At third base, we have Gunnar Henderson, who hit a home run yesterday. He's been going through little ups and downs through this season as he started here, but he's been hitting the ball. He hit the ball finally yesterday for the first time in a few games, and I look for him to add on to that since this is another good matchup for him. Again, that game should be pretty high scoring. Rafael Devers is definitely a guy I really like against Bradish, who he's got a 4.55 average against Bradish in his career, and he's been hitting the ball extremely well as of late, and I think he's due for another big game. Alex Bregman is another guy I like here against Dave East for Houston. I don't like him as much as Devers, simply because he hasn't been hitting the ball all that great lately, but he is kind of due for a big game. Moncada for the Chicago White Sox look like he's in a really good spot here, and he's averaging 9.4 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's had some really solid games. I look for him to continue that in this plus matchup for the Chicago White Sox. Austin Riley is one of the few guys on the Braves who's still been hitting the ball pretty consistent lately. He's averaging almost 7 fantasy points a game. Obviously, he's had a couple bad games, but he has home run potential every time he comes up to bat, and this is a really nice matchup for him. He's also hit .438 against the pitcher with 2 home runs from Washington's pitcher, which is Espinosa, who's pretty terrible. And then finally, Matt Chapman for Toronto against the Yankees, another guy I like for Toronto. He's hitting almost 10 fantasy points a game for the last 10. Though he hasn't been quite as good lately in the last few games, he's still getting hits in most of them. At shortstop, we have Jorge Mateo for Baltimore against Waka. I really like him in this particular matchup, even though he hasn't been good the last 10, really. He's had some really good games in the last 4. Then we're going to look at Brandon Crawford for San Francisco, who's been extremely good against Marquise in his career, averaging .351 with a home run. And he doesn't need to have a home run in this game to pay off because his price is cheap enough where he can get 8 or 10 points and you can feel happy about that. Jeremy Pena is a guy I like here, even though he's day-to-day, he may or may not play, but he's averaging 8.5 points a game. He's finally out of his slump, and so if he plays, he's definitely in a plus matchup against Arizona. Bo Bichette is probably one of my favorite guys to potentially hit a home run today. He's averaging 7.2 fantasy points the last 10 games. He also has a .381 average against the Yankees pitcher Talion. And then finally, Francisco Lindor for the Mets. He's been extremely well against Lopez in his career, .353 with a home run. He's also averaging 11.6 the last 10 games. Though he is a little bit boomer and bust, he's having some really solid games. This is a really nice plus matchup for him. And the outfielder, I have Lane Thomas for Washington. He's one of the couple guys from Washington that I like. He's averaging 7 fantasy points a game, and he's been pretty good against Atlanta this season. And this is probably Atlanta's worst pitcher, Mueller. Menini's for Washington is another guy I really like. He's always under the radar. Granted, his price is not. But he's been hitting the ball extremely well this season. He and Michael Harris are very close to me liking their potential output for fantasy purposes. I'll just go ahead and mention Michael Harris as well because he's in a great spot against Washington, and he's been hitting the ball extremely well lately, 9 fantasy points a game. His price has finally come up some, but I still think he's somebody that you can use. Yastrzemski for San Francisco is another guy I like. He's hitting 7.5 the last 10. He's finally starting to get going this season. He's been pretty rough all season, but he's starting to hit the ball pretty well lately. And so I think he's somebody you have to take into consideration, and he's pretty inexpensive. And then we're going to look at Taylor Ward, who's still too cheap for his production this season. He's averaging 10 fantasy points the last 10 games. The only real issue he has is that he doesn't, the only guys on their team really is Ohtani and Trout that really hit the ball well. Cedric Mullins is a top option today for a home run as well. He's actually hit 500 and more than 10 at-bats against Waka. However, he has been hitting the ball pretty good, 8.2 the last 10 with 2 home runs. But he's been a little bit boomer bust lately. He had a little bit of a slump for a little while, but he seems like he's gotten out of that. His price point, too, on DraftKings kind of stinks compared to on FanDuel, where he's almost minimum priced over there because of the slump he was in. Alex Verdugo is looking pretty solid over here on DraftKings. He's having almost 6.5 fantasy points a game. He's having some pretty solid games lately. Tommy Pham's another guy that hasn't been all of that great lately, just a 6.5. but he's got some real upside in these last couple games, and this particular game too is a game I really think Boston and Baltimore are going to score some points. Or runs for rather. And then JD Martinez for Boston. He's another guy that's hit the ball pretty well. 7.3, 2 home runs the last 10. He also had a nice big home run yesterday, and I look for him to continue to do that against Baltimore this series. Teoscar Hernandez, another guy I really like for home run potential. He's averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game, and he's had some really big games, and he's really not having that many bad games. He's also 333 with 2 home runs against Tallien in his career. Tyler Naquin's another guy that I think is in a pretty solid spot for the Mets. He's not hit the ball very well lately, but he does have some upside in this particular matchup, and he had a good game last game. Then we're going to look at Jeff McNeil for the Mets. He's been really good this season, and he's hitting 7.1 fantasy points the last 10, which is right on his career average, or season average. He's just been pretty consistent at hitting the ball pretty well. For Brandon Nimmo, excuse me, for the Mets, he's averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game. He's hitting a whopping 325, and he's really not had many bad games lately. And then finally, Austin Hayes. Now, I don't like him as much simply because he hasn't been scoring the fantasy points. He's at 5.8 fantasy points the last 10 games, but he's still hitting 310. But the catch with that is that several of these games he's been pitch hitting late, so you do need to make sure he starts. But if he does start, he's definitely in play. He's also hit 400 against his career against Waka this year. With that said, I think we have a really solid slate here. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Make sure again to like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and have a nice day, everybody.